I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Lazarus was dying when his sisters sent word to Jesus. The message reached him. Jesus knew how serious the situation was, but instead of leaving for Bethany immediately, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. By the time Jesus finally arrived, Lazarus wasn't merely dead. John makes a point of giving us one precise detail. He had already been in the tomb for 4 days, and that number turns the delay into one of the most unsettling questions in the Gospel. Because Jesus loved Lazarus, he could have gone sooner, and John makes it clear that his absence wasn't simply a matter of arriving too late. So why wait while the situation became irreversible? And more importantly, why did John need us to know that it was already the 4th day? The raising of Lazarus is one of the most familiar stories in the Gospel of John. Most of us remember the ending first, the stone being moved away, Jesus standing before the tomb, and a man everyone believed was gone walking back into the light. But when we rush straight to the miracle, we miss the very thing that makes this story so unsettling. Jesus could have left sooner, and he didn't. We read John chapter 11 with an enormous advantage. We already know how the story ends. Martha and Mary did not. All they knew was that their brother was seriously ill, and they had sent an urgent message to the one person they believed could help him. John makes a point of emphasizing how close this family was to Jesus. Their message needed no elaborate explanation. Lord, the one you love is sick. Bethany was near Jerusalem while Jesus was staying across the Jordan. Naturally, once the message arrived, we would expect him to begin the journey back immediately. After all, John had already described Jesus healing the sick and performing extraordinary signs. If there was anyone Martha and Mary wanted to see approaching their home at that moment, it was him. But John records something completely unexpected. When Jesus hears about Lazarus, he says that this illness will serve the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Then John adds a detail that makes his response even harder to understand. Although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he remained where he was for 2 more days. That distinction matters. Jesus did not simply sit somewhere for 4 days before beginning the journey. John tells us that he stayed for 2 additional days, and that by the time he eventually reached Bethany, Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. So why wait those 2 days? And why does John make such a point of telling us that 4 full days had passed by the time Jesus stood outside Lazarus' tomb? The chapter itself begins to give us clues. Jesus connects what is happening with the glory of God. Later, after telling the disciples plainly that Lazarus has died, he adds another crucial phrase: "What they are about to witness will also happen so that you may believe." Those words, not explanations added centuries later, are where we need to begin if we want to understand the meaning of the delay. Because the real question may not simply be why Jesus arrived too late. The real question is what needed to become unmistakably clear when he finally stood before that tomb. To understand why Jesus' delay feels so unsettling, we need to return to the moment when everything still seemed preventable. In Bethany lived Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, 3 siblings who shared a special relationship with Jesus. John never tells us exactly how that relationship began, but from the opening of the story he makes one thing unmistakably clear: Jesus loved this family. That is what makes the message from the sisters so striking. They don't make an elaborate request. They don't tell Jesus what he needs to do. They simply send word: "Lord, the one you love is sick." The sentence carries all the urgency it needs. Lazarus is seriously ill, and Martha and Mary make sure the news reaches Jesus. For anyone who has already followed the signs recorded in John's Gospel, the expected response seems obvious. Jesus can intervene. And this is where the first decisive moment of the story unfolds. The message finally reaches Jesus. Someone he loves is sick. The natural expectation is that he will immediately set out for Bethany, or perhaps act without making the journey at all. That second possibility would not have been unprecedented. Earlier in John's Gospel, a royal official had approached Jesus because his son was gravely ill in Capernaum. Jesus told him, "Go, your son will live." When the man returned home, he discovered that his son had begun to recover at the very hour Jesus spoke those words. So when the message about Lazarus arrives, the reader already knows that physical distance has not prevented Jesus from acting before. But this time, he does neither. He does not immediately leave for Bethany. and he does not pronounce a healing from a distance. Instead, Jesus says, "This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." For us, knowing what happens later, those words point towards something much greater. But at that moment, the disciples still have no idea what they are about to witness. Then John places two details side by side that seem almost impossible to reconcile. First, he emphasizes that Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. Immediately afterward, he tells us that when Jesus heard Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. That contrast is what makes this moment so powerful. The message has arrived. Jesus knows what is happening. John has just reminded us how deeply he cares for this family, and still, he does not leave. John does not tell us what Jesus did during every hour of those 2 days, and there is no reason to fill that silence with details the Gospel never gives us. What John does tell us is enough to sustain the mystery. Jesus received the message, yet remained where he was. Only after those 2 days does he turn to his disciples and say, "Let us go to Judea again." But by then, something in Bethany has already changed. What began as an urgent message about a sick man is about to become something far more serious. Because before that journey begins, Jesus tells his disciples what they do not yet know: Lazarus is dead. Now we reach the most unsettling part of the story. The message has arrived. Jesus knows that Lazarus is sick, and John has just emphasized that he loves Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. Everything seems to point toward an immediate departure. Yet the opposite happens. Jesus stays where he is for 2 more days. John places these details together in a way that makes the tension impossible to ignore. He does not tell us how Jesus spent those hours. He records no second message arriving from Bethany, and he gives us no glimpse of what the disciples may have been thinking while they waited. That silence prevents us from inventing details, but it makes the one fact John does record even more striking. Jesus does not leave. And there is a geographical detail that raises the tension even further. Jesus had withdrawn across the Jordan to the area where John the Baptist had once been baptizing. Bethany, however, was near Jerusalem. Going back to Lazarus meant returning to Judea, the very region where opposition to Jesus had become increasingly dangerous. In the previous chapter, his opponents had already picked up stones to kill him, and Jesus had withdrawn from the area. So when the 2 days finally pass and Jesus tells his disciples, "Let us go to Judea again," their reaction is not relief, it is alarm. They remind him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?" Suddenly the journey to Bethany carries a second layer of danger. While the reader is thinking about Lazarus, the disciples are also thinking about what may happen to Jesus. He is not simply deciding when to visit a sick friend. Within John's narrative, he is choosing to return to a place where his own life has already been threatened. Jesus responds by speaking about walking while there is light, but then turns the conversation back to Lazarus. "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." The disciples take his words literally. If Lazarus is sleeping, they reason, perhaps that means he is recovering. John pauses to explain that Jesus is speaking about death, while the disciples think he means ordinary sleep. Then comes one of the sharpest moments in the entire account. Jesus drops the figurative language and says plainly, "Lazarus has died." In an instant, the disciples learn what Martha and Mary are already facing in Bethany. What they may have imagined as a journey to visit a sick man has become something entirely different. But Jesus follows that announcement with an even more surprising statement. "And for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Those words have to be read carefully. Jesus is not expressing pleasure over Lazarus' death. What he connects to the disciples' faith is the fact that he was not there, and what they are about to witness because of it. For the first time, the gospel itself gives us a direct clue about the delay. Something is still going to happen in front of these disciples, and it will have something to do with their belief. That statement also echoes what Jesus said when the message first arrived. Then, he connected Lazarus' illness with the glory of God. Now, after announcing Lazarus' death, he says, "so that you may believe." John is beginning to place 2 ideas at the center of the story: glory and faith. And both will return when Jesus finally stands before the tomb, but the conversation is not over. Thomas, also called Didymus, understands the danger of going back to Judea, and in a moment that reveals just how serious the disciples believe this journey could be, he turns to the others and says, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." It is a short sentence, but it changes the atmosphere completely. They are setting out because Lazarus has died, while fearing that the same journey could lead Jesus, and perhaps them, to death as well. There is a powerful irony in that moment. The disciples are travelling toward the tomb of a dead man while walking with Jesus back toward the region where the conflict surrounding him will intensify. They do not yet understand everything that lies ahead, but the road to Bethany is also taking Jesus closer to the events that will lead to his own death. So the 2-day delay cannot simply be treated as indecision or an unfortunate late departure. John presents Jesus as aware of Lazarus' death, willing to return despite the danger, and explicitly connecting his absence with something the disciples still need to witness. But one part of the mystery remains unresolved. Jesus stayed where he was for 2 additional days, yet John has not said that Jesus simply waited 4 days before travelling. The 4 days only become significant when he reaches Bethany and finds Lazarus already buried. And while Jesus and his disciples begin the journey back toward Judea, no one in Bethany is waiting for a healing anymore. Martha and Mary's house is already filled with mourners, and Lazarus is already in the tomb. While Jesus and his disciples begin making their way back toward Judea, the situation in Bethany has already changed completely. Lazarus is dead. John does not tell us what illness took his life, describe his final hours, or record the exact moment of his death. But when Jesus finally approaches the village, the Gospel gives us the detail that matters most to this investigation. Lazarus has already been in the tomb for 4 days. In first-century Jewish culture, burial normally took place quickly, often on the same day a person died or shortly afterward. John does not reconstruct every detail of Lazarus' funeral, but he makes it clear that the burial has already taken place and that Martha and Mary are now in mourning. Many people have come to their home to comfort them after the loss of their brother. That means what happens next will not unfold in private. There are witnesses around this family, people who know Lazarus has died and who are there precisely because of his death. And this is where John gives us a particularly important moment. Martha and Mary's house is filled with mourners when word begins to spread that Jesus is approaching. This is no longer the moment when someone can be sent out to ask him to heal Lazarus. The atmosphere has changed. There is now a grieving family, visitors gathered to console them, and somewhere outside the village, Jesus is finally drawing near. Then John gives us the detail that changes the entire story. Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. That number has inspired a well-known explanation. A rabbinic tradition preserved in later sources describes the soul as remaining near the body for the first 3 days after death. Because of that tradition, the 4th day is often connected to the story of Lazarus, with the suggestion that Jesus deliberately waited until that point. But we need to draw an important line here. John never mentions that belief, and he never says Jesus waited because of it. The tradition may help us understand how the passage was interpreted later, but it should not be presented as the biblical explanation for Jesus' delay. The gospel itself gives us something far more concrete. Later, when Jesus orders the stone to be removed from the tomb, Martha immediately objects, "Lord, by this time there will be an odour, for he has been dead 4 days." For Martha, there is no uncertainty about her brother's condition. Lazarus is not a sick man who might still recover. He has died, he has been buried, and enough time has passed for the physical consequences of death to become unavoidable. That is what gives the 4 days such weight within John's narrative. By the time Jesus arrives, everyone around that family is dealing with a death they understand to be final. What began as an urgent request to save a sick man has become something that, from their perspective, can no longer be reversed. And if you enjoy these investigations where we carefully separate what the biblical text actually says from interpretations that developed later, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories are reaching. Because at that very moment, news of Jesus' arrival reaches Martha, and she does something that immediately changes the pace of the story. She leaves the house and goes out to meet him before he even enters the village. After 4 days of mourning, Martha is finally standing before the man she and her sister had called for while Lazarus was still alive, and the first words she speaks carry all the grief, disappointment, and unanswered questions of those lost days. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus finally approaches Bethany, Lazarus has already been in the tomb for 4 days. Martha hears that he is coming and immediately leaves the house to meet him, while Mary remains behind with those who have gathered to mourn. The moment Martha reaches Jesus, she says the words that capture all the tension that has been building since the message was first sent. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Her words carry grief, but they do not necessarily sound like a rejection of Jesus. In fact, Martha immediately adds, "But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Somehow, even after 4 days of mourning, her trust has not completely disappeared. Jesus tells her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha understands this in the way many Jews of the period understood the hope of resurrection as something that would happen in the future, at the end of the age. "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day," she replies. But Jesus shifts the conversation away from a distant event and toward himself, declaring, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live." Then he asks Martha directly, "Do you believe this?" Her answer is a confession of faith. She believes he is the Christ, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world. But the story is still moving toward the tomb. Martha returns home and quietly tells Mary that the teacher has arrived and is calling for her. Mary rises quickly and goes to him, and the mourners gathered in the house follow her, assuming she's heading to Lazarus's tomb to weep. Instead, they follow her directly into another deeply emotional encounter. Mary reaches Jesus, falls at his feet, and says almost exactly what her sister had said. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Now both sisters have expressed the same painful conviction. They believed Jesus could have changed the outcome if he had arrived before Lazarus died, but he is standing before them only after the moment they believed could still be changed has passed. John then slows the narrative and focuses on Jesus himself. He sees Mary weeping and the people who came with her weeping as well, and John describes him as deeply moved and troubled. The Greek expression used here is unusually strong and has been interpreted in different ways, possibly carrying a sense of indignation as well as profound emotional disturbance. John does not explicitly tell us what that emotion is directed toward, so what we can say with confidence is simpler. Jesus is not emotionally detached from the grief surrounding him. He asks, "Where have you laid him?" They answer, "Lord, come and see." And then John records one of the shortest and most memorable sentences in the entire Gospel. Jesus wept. That moment matters because it prevents us from interpreting Jesus' knowledge of what is about to happen as indifference toward Martha and Mary. He already knows Lazarus is dead. He has already connected this event with the glory of God and with the faith of his disciples. Yet standing in front of a grieving family and surrounded by people mourning someone he loved, Jesus weeps. Some of those watching respond, "See how he loved him." But others ask the very question that has followed this story from the beginning. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Now the mystery of the delay is no longer confined to Martha and Mary. The crowd itself has voiced it. If Jesus could heal, why had he not prevented Lazarus from dying? John carries that question all the way to the place where it can no longer remain theoretical. Jesus approaches the tomb, a cave with a stone lying against its entrance. Martha and Mary are there, the mourners who followed them are there, the disciples are there, and behind that stone lies Lazarus, dead for 4 days. The waiting is over, and the question that began with a message from Bethany is now standing in front of a sealed tomb. Then Jesus gives an order that immediately forces Martha to confront what lies on the other side of that stone. Take away the stone. Now we come to the detail at the centre of this investigation. Why does John make a point of telling us that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days? As we've seen, one popular explanation comes from a rabbinic tradition preserved in later sources, according to which the soul remained near the body during the first 3 days after death. That idea is often connected to Lazarus, suggesting that Jesus deliberately waited until the 4th day, so that even this possibility had passed. But the Gospel itself never gives us that explanation. John never mentions this belief, and he never says that Jesus timed his arrival in order to overcome it. So if we want the strongest answer the text itself can support, we have to look elsewhere. John gives us 3 important clues. The first comes when Jesus initially hears that Lazarus is sick and says that what is happening will serve the glory of God. The second comes after he tells the disciples that Lazarus has died, when he connects his absence with the purpose, "so that you may believe." And the third appears at the tomb itself, when Jesus gives the command, "Take away the stone." Martha immediately objects, "Lord, By this time there will be an odour, for he has been dead 4 days. Her reaction tells us what those 4 days mean inside the story. Martha is not expecting to find her brother alive. She's not holding on to the possibility that he might simply recover. As far as she is concerned, death has already begun to leave its physical consequences. That is where the chronology becomes so important. John does not need to tell us that Jesus was counting down to a particular hour, and we do not need to assign him a calculation the Gospel never records. What the text does make clear is that when Jesus arrives, Lazarus has been dead and buried long enough for his own sister to acknowledge the reality of decomposition. The situation has moved far beyond illness, and that changes the nature of what is about to happen. If Jesus had arrived while Lazarus was still sick and restored his health, the story would have been another healing. But now there is no illness left to cure. Martha and Mary are mourning. Friends and relatives have gathered to comfort them. Lazarus has been behind a stone for 4 days, and everyone standing there understands why they have come to that tomb. At the same time, we should not claim that the 4-day delay made disbelief impossible. John himself tells us that after what happens next, some witnesses believe in Jesus, while others go to the Pharisees and report what they have seen. The sign does not force every observer to reach the same conclusion, so the answer is more precise than many popular explanations suggest. John does not tell us that Jesus waited specifically for a 4th day because of a belief about the soul. What he does show us is that the delay brings the story to a point where Lazarus is unmistakably presented as dead within the narrative itself. And Jesus has already connected what is about to happen with 2 things: the glory of God and the faith of those who will witness it. Now, standing before the tomb, those clues finally converge. Martha has just warned him about what lies behind the stone. Jesus answers her with words that reach all the way back to the beginning of the story. "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" The waiting is over. The stone is about to be moved. And what began as an urgent request to save a sick man now requires something entirely different. Jesus is no longer standing before an illness that can be healed. He's standing before the tomb of Lazarus. Everything now converges on a single stone. Jesus has arrived after Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. Martha has already acknowledged what that means physically, and around them stand the disciples, the grieving sisters, and the people who came to comfort the family. It is in front of all of them that Jesus gives the command, "Take away the stone." Martha hesitates because from her perspective, opening that tomb means confronting a reality that has already become irreversible. But Jesus answers by returning to the promise he has been building toward from the beginning. "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" The stone is moved, and before Jesus calls Lazarus out, he does something that reveals the public purpose of what is about to happen. He looks upward and prays, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." Once again, John places faith at the centre of the moment. Earlier, Jesus told his disciples that his absence would serve a purpose, so that you may believe. Now, standing before the open tomb, he prays aloud for the sake of the people watching, that they may believe. Then comes the moment toward which the entire story has been moving. There is no elaborate ritual and no long series of actions. Jesus simply cries out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the man who had been dead comes out of the tomb. John describes him emerging with his hands and feet still bound with burial cloths, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus turns to those standing nearby and says, "Unbind him and let him go." The simplicity of John's description is part of what makes the scene so powerful. He does not attempt to explain biologically what happened inside the tomb or describe the process by which Lazarus returned to life. He simply completes the contrast he has been building from the beginning. When the message was sent, Lazarus was sick. When Jesus decided to return to Judea, Lazarus was dead. When Jesus arrived in Bethany, he had already been buried for 4 days, and now the man everyone had come to mourn is standing before them alive. This is where the function of the delay becomes clearest within John's narrative. The sign does not happen while Lazarus is still sick and could be restored through another healing. It happens after his death has become an established reality for everyone surrounding the tomb. The delay that appeared at first to mean absence or abandonment has brought the story to the point where Jesus' words about glory and belief are demonstrated in the most dramatic way possible. But John does not end the episode with a simple celebration. What happens at the tomb immediately produces consequences. Many of the people who had come to Mary and witnessed what Jesus did believe in him. Others go to the Pharisees and report what has happened. The news reaches the chief priests and Pharisees, who gather the council and begin discussing what to do about Jesus. Their concern is that his signs will draw more and more people to him. It is in this context that Caiaphas, the high priest that year, declares that it would be better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish, words that John interprets prophetically. Then the Gospel records a chilling consequence. From that day on, they began making plans to put Jesus to death. That connection gives the raising of Lazarus an even deeper place in John's story. The sign that brings Lazarus out of his tomb also intensifies the opposition that will eventually lead Jesus toward his own death. John does not suggest that the conflict began here. It had been growing long before Bethany. But he deliberately places the council's decision immediately after this extraordinary sign, linking Lazarus' return to life with the approaching passion. And now, the mystery that began with a message from two desperate sisters finally has its answer. Jesus is not portrayed as someone who lost control of the situation or simply arrived too late. John connects the delay with the glory of God and with the faith of those who would witness what happened. The 4 days make clear within the story what Martha, Mary, and everyone around that tomb already understood. Lazarus was not waiting to recover from an illness. He was dead. And that is why, when Jesus' voice reaches into the tomb and Lazarus walks out, John is no longer presenting another healing. He is presenting the most dramatic sign in Jesus' public ministry before the events that lead to the cross, a sign that begins with what looked like an unbearable delay and ends with 3 words that overturn everything the people at that tomb believed was final. Lazarus, come out. So why did Jesus wait before going to Lazarus? After following the entire account, the strongest answer does not depend on a hidden calculation about the 4th day, or on a later tradition that John never presents as the reason for the delay. The answer is found in the Gospel's own words. From the beginning, Jesus connects what is happening with the glory of God. Later, when he tells the disciples that Lazarus has died, he explains that his absence will also serve a purpose, so that you may believe. And at the tomb, just before calling Lazarus out, he once again speaks about faith in front of the people who are watching. The 4 days, then, do not need an explanation added to the text in order to matter. By the time Jesus reaches Bethany, Lazarus is no longer a critically ill man waiting to be healed. He has been buried, his family is mourning, and Martha herself acknowledges that decomposition has already begun. John has brought the story to a point where everyone standing outside that tomb understands the same thing. Lazarus is truly dead. And that is what gives the delay its power within the narrative. The sign does not happen before Lazarus dies, preventing death from taking him. It happens afterward. The same Jesus who told Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life," now demonstrates the meaning of those words before everyone gathered at the tomb. But John leaves us with one final consequence. Lazarus walks out alive, many witnesses believe, and the opposition against Jesus intensifies. The sign that restores Lazarus to his sisters also pushes the story closer to the events that will lead Jesus to the cross. Bethany is not simply the end of one family's tragedy. It becomes a turning point on the road toward the Passion, and stories like this reveal why understanding the Bible often requires more than remembering isolated episodes. Kings, prophets, empires, and major events appear across different books and historical periods, and seeing how those pieces fit together can completely change the way we understand the larger biblical story. That is exactly why we created the ebook The Bible in Chronological Order. It is a visual guide designed to help you follow the biblical story from Genesis to Revelation, placing major people and events into a clearer historical sequence and helping you see how different parts of Scripture connect. And when you get your copy, you're not only gaining a resource to accompany your reading and study, you're also helping our team continue producing investigative biblical documentaries like this one. The official link to get the Bible in chronological order is pinned in the first comment, because in the end, John does not ask us to reconstruct every hour of Jesus' delay. He directs our attention to what that delay revealed. When Jesus finally reached Bethany, Martha believed the moment for intervention had already passed. The stone had sealed the tomb. 4 days had gone by, and it was precisely there, in front of what everyone believed was already beyond reversal, that John presents the most dramatic sign of Jesus' ministry before the Passion. Lazarus, come out.